sites. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In the latest developments in Egypt, newly appointed Vice President Omar Suleiman held talks Sunday with opposition groups in Cairo in an attempt to stem the anti-government protests which continue across the country. While Suleiman agreed to several major concessions, including ending the country's decades-old emergency laws, allowing a free press and creating a committee to propose constitutional reforms, the #1 demand of protesters, the immediate removal of President Hosni Mubarak from power, was not addressed. Participants at the meeting included members of secular opposition parties, members of the business community, some youth representatives, and a move that's been called highly significant, the band Muslim Brotherhood, was also included in the talks. Speaking on Sunday, the newly appointed Secretary General of the ruling NDP party, Hossam, said he believed the government's being responsive to demands.
Lifting the emergency state once the security situation is over is the declared intention, so that the people are reassured. The release of political detainees, especially those young people from the 25th of January movement, I think is a strong message that our attitude has shifted.
Despite government promises, protests continue today across Egypt. Tens of thousands of demonstrators held their ground in Tahrir Square amidst a heavy military presence. According to the Egyptian newspaper Masri al-Hum, leaders of several youth organizations calling themselves the Coalition of the Angry Youth Uprising said they would not agree to negotiations with the regime until the primary demand of Mubarak's resignation was met. They also said the involvement of youth activists at the talks Sunday was not to negotiate but to convey their list of demands. Meanwhile, leading opposition figure and Nobel Peace Laureate Mohammed al-Baradei said he was not invited to the talks, although representatives of his group, the National Association for Change, was present. Speaking with David Gregory on NBC's Meet the Press, al-Baradei called the government's intentions opaque. He also reiterated the demand that President Mubarak step down and said a caretaker interim government should be appointed until elections could be held.
There is still a huge lack of confidence between the government and the demonstrators. There's a good deal of fear that the government will retrench and then come back, again with vengeance, if you like. The process is opaque. The regime, which he represents, lost legitimacy, and he needs to assume political responsibility and step aside and get the country to move on and cede power to a transitional presidential council, government, caretaker government, and have a year of transition where we can really have free and fair election, including, which I haven't heard from Richard, including the right to establish parties. That is key, for people to establish parties and to take the time to go and engage, and then you will have, among other guarantees, fair and free election in a year time from now. Suspend the constitution, suspend the parliament, have a provisional constitution. We cannot go through democracy through the current constitution, which is a dictatorial one.
We go now to Cairo, where we're joined by Democracy Now! Senior producer Sharif Kouddous. Sharif, welcome to Democracy Now! We're also joined by Hossam, an Egyptian human rights activist. It's great to have you back in a studio, Sharif. It has been a remarkable 14 days. This is day 14 of the uprising in Egypt. Before we talk about anything else, talk about what's happening on the ground right now in Tahrir Square and around Cairo.
Well, Amy, we saw yesterday was the Sunday, what they call the Sunday of Martyrs, and tens of thousands of people filled Tahrir Square. I was surprised to see the level of the number of people that showed up yesterday, and it was a very festive atmosphere. A lot of families, a lot of children. What appeared to be fewer of the Muslim Brotherhood were in attendance yesterday, and a lot of people were carrying pictures of the dead, what they call the martyrs who were killed in the revolution. And they say if this was a revolution, then they are martyrs. And what they they continue to stress is that even the most minimum of demands that they have called for have not been met. The Mubarak regime continues to make these so-called concessions. None of these concessions are things that the protesters have called for. These negotiations that took place yesterday, members of the April 6th youth movement were not represented at the table. They say they want the Mubarak regime's ouster, and after that then they can look to talks. That is their number one principal demand, and that has not yet been met. Joining me here in Cairo is Hossam Bahgat. He's the director of the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights. And Hossam, a lot of the talk right now is about constitutional changes, dissolving parliament, and the resignation of the president. And one of the issues that people say is that if the president resigns first, then these changes cannot be implemented. They're trying workarounds. What is the latest?
Look, the consensus amongst everyone is right now that the solution can only begin with Mubarak stepping down. Now, there are some differences, technical differences about whether he should resign fully immediately or whether he should step aside by delegating all of his powers to the vice president, like he did when he was hospitalized in 2004 and later in 2010, and then in a couple of weeks resign once we have ensured that we have the provisions that are necessary for a meaningful presidential election. I am of the view that if Mubarak is to resign immediately, then it is 100% certain that Omar Suleiman will be elected within 60 days as a president for a full presidential term of 6 years. That is not a prospect that would satisfy me as an advocate for democracy and human rights, and someone who wants to see a real end to 3 decades of Mubarak rule. Omar Suleiman's succession will unfortunately be a continuation, in my view, of the Mubarak regime and the violations perpetrated under Mubarak. So I am of the view that Mubarak must immediately step down by delegating all of his authorities to his vice president, that we need within a couple of weeks to put to a public referendum some amendments of the constitutional provisions to make sure that we can have free and fair presidential elections.
Hossam,
and what are these amendments to the Constitution? Sorry, go ahead, Amy.
Just before you get to the amendment, Sharif, I wanted to ask Hossam, as you talk about Omar Suleiman, exactly what are your concerns with him? You are a human rights activist. We have reported on his working closely with the U.S. CIA with extraordinary rendition. Why don't you lay out for us who this man is who was just chosen by Mubarak in the last week to be his vice president?
Sure. Look, Amy, he's been in this position as director of the Egyptian General Intelligence Service since 1993. But obviously, we only learned about this in 2007 because up until then, he was not a public persona. We did not know who the head of our intelligence service was. Since 2007, he started to appear, but again, we only knew how he looked like and we knew his name. We knew absolutely nothing about him until, of course, some truth started emerging about the U.S.-led so-called war on terror. And of course, his name started featuring prominently in all the books that came out, the documents that were obtained through some freedom of information requests and litigation in the United States. And that's, of course, when we started to find out that he was the most reliable partner in the Middle East in the extraordinary rendition program. He oversaw the transfer and interrogation of terror suspects, not just in Egypt, but in other countries of the region. And then, of course, there is the post-WikiLeaks era in which we started to also read transcripts of private meetings that he held with some U.S. officials. And in them, we started to also find out more about his involvement in domestic affairs, not just in foreign policy issues, but also his role in the starvation of the people of Gaza, his role in using the economic blockade that the Egyptian government has been involved involved in order to pressure the Gazans to turn against Hamas and to pressure Hamas as well to accept to sign a deal in the Egyptian brokered reconciliation with Fatah. And interestingly, it is exactly this that he's been trying also with the protesters in Tahrir now, using economics, citing economic hardships to turn the people against the protesters, and also trying to control, at least for a few days until very recently, trying to prohibit people from taking food and medical supplies and blankets into Tahrir Square for the protesters. And then most recently, since his appointment as a vice president, he's given one long TV interview with the state television, in which, of course, it became very clear that he accused all those that insisted on remaining in Tahrir Square despite the violence and the shootings and the food deprivation. He accused all of us of implementing a foreign agenda, and he used implicit and then later very explicit threats of retaliation against us. Yesterday, with the round of negotiations or so-called dialogue that he had with some representatives of political forces, again, it became very clear that he does not enter these negotiations on an equal footing with representatives of the protesters. He sent everyone home and then decided to deliver a statement of what he called a consensus that resulted from these consultations. And later we had a number of representatives of political forces, most importantly the Muslim Brotherhood, saying that is not true. We did not agree to these things. This was only a protocol session. It is the first session of this dialogue. Each one of us expressed their views, and then we were told that we will be invited back, and suddenly we were surprised to see Suleiman announcing the understandings or agreements, as he called them, to Egyptian television. And of course, in this announcement that Suleiman made, he said, no, the president is not going to resign. No, the president is not going to delegate his powers to his vice president. And no, we're not going to lift the state of emergency immediately. We're only going to do this when there is no longer a security threat, which, of course, the government of Egypt says has been since 1981.
Hossam, Bahgat, we're going to break. Sharif, we're going to come back to this discussion after the break. Hossam Bahgat is Egyptian human rights activist, founder and executive director of the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights. He is in Cairo with Democracy Now! Senior producer Sharif Kouddous. We'll hear more from them in a moment.